So I gave in. I purchased my first digital Leica. And today we're gonna go over it. Bear in mind, my opinions about this camera are solely based on my personal experience owning it for the past 2 to 3 months. So if you're looking for a highly technical review about this camera, this video may not be for you. But I will go over some specs and some things that I noticed using this camera right off the bat. But for context, I was in Vienna, Austria with my friend Joskenny Lua, and we happened to accidentally stumble upon the Leica store. Long story short, we were able to test out the Leica M11, SL3, and Q3. Now, as much as I loved the M11, considering I already own Leica's M4-2, which is one of their rangefinders from the 1970s, that price tag. The price tag for the M11 was just a little too crazy for me, considering I'd have to purchase not only the M11 body for around $10,000, but also potentially one of their $2,000 or $3,000 lenses on top of that. I just didn't have it in me to make a purchase like that at this time in my life, but maybe someday. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Meanwhile, the SL3 just wasn't necessary for my needs, considering I already shoot with Sony's A7 series cameras for my professional work. Both of these cameras, whether the Leica or Sony, have fairly larger form factor bodies, which I don't think is as ideal for street photography, in my opinion. Typically, when I'm thinking of purchasing a Leica camera, I'm thinking more from a street photography perspective. Finally, the Leica Q3 just seemed like the perfect fit for me, considering a slightly less expensive price tag and a built-in 28mm Summilux lens. Now, the Leica Q3 does go for around $6,300 US, brand new, but thankfully I was able to find it for around $5,500 used. That is still a very hefty price tag, but unfortunately, that's the price you pay when you decide to go Leica, so it is what it is. Now, of course, I'd love the ability to switch out lenses on this camera, but like I said, I really did have to pick and choose my battles with this purchase, and I thought about it and decided maybe the 28mm wouldn't be so bad. I've never really shot with a 28mm focal length before, but I knew that I wanted to improve my street photography skills and get more intimate shots of my subjects. There's a very famous quote by Robert Capa where he says, "If your pictures aren't good enough, you aren't close enough." So with that quote in mind, I decided that the 28mm focal length would force me to get a lot closer to my subjects, and I wouldn't have that same comfort as using, say, a 50 or 85mm focal length. So while I did take a risk purchasing this camera knowing I may not end up enjoying the 28mm shooting experience, I took it as a challenge and an opportunity to grow as a photographer, and I think that's important. Now, while megapixels are probably the least important aspect I think of when shooting street photography, it is a luxury in itself to be able to have as many as 60 megapixels in what's basically a point-and-shoot camera. Now, with the Leica Q3 having its highest resolution at 60 megapixels, I'm able to have a lot of flexibility when cropping into subjects in post if, let's say, I was a little further away from my subject than originally planned. Now, let's say you don't need all those megapixels, well, you still have the option to shoot in medium resolution at 36 megapixels or smaller resolution at 18 megapixels. And of course, this will save you a lot of SD card space in the end. But what I did notice about the frame lines in this camera is that the higher focal length or digital crop that you choose, the more megapixel loss there is, understandably. Aside from the 28mm focal length, the Q3 now has a digital crop capability of 35, 50, 75, and 90mm frame lines. On this graph, you'll see that there's megapixel loss on just about each crop-in that you do, depending on which resolution your camera settings are at. Now, before purchasing this camera, I did notice mixed reviews about its battery life, but from my experience using it so far, I've pretty much been able to maintain battery life in one single battery for an entire day. Bear in mind, whenever I go out and shoot, I typically turn off my camera in between shooting if, let's say, there's not much action to capture, or if I'm simply walking. At the same time, I haven't really felt the need to use the geotag or Bluetooth settings that much on this camera either, so maybe that also preserves battery life for me as well. But every time I spend a day in Venice, for example, I'm typically shooting for around 3 to 5 hours, and I really haven't found the need to pull out my second battery yet. But that brings me to my next point, which is battery cost. These Leica Q3 batteries are not cheap, they are expensive. You're gonna find these BP SCL6 batteries brand new for about $200, so thankfully I was able to find a used battery on eBay because I just could not find the justification to spend $200 on a single battery, but that's just me. Lastly, one thing I wish Leica would introduce in a future firmware is its battery percentage indicator. Again, the thing I love about my Sony cameras is the ability to see my battery percentage and know exactly how much battery life I have in the camera at the time. Meanwhile, with the Leica Q3, for example, I kind of have to guess exactly how much battery life I might have based off of the little icon at the top right corner of the screen. The next thing I enjoy yet struggle with a bit on this camera is the tilting LCD screen. Now, while I love the ability to be able to pull out the tilt screen if, let's say, I'm trying to get a hip shot, for example, I find that the grooves at the bottom of the screen are just a little bit difficult to grab with my finger. And sometimes I find myself struggling to pull out the screen, which can definitely cause you to potentially miss your shot if you're depending on that. Speaking of form factor, I will say that this camera is the perfect size for me. I have baby hands, so it's not as big as, say, Sony's mirrorless cameras or the Leica SL series cameras. It does have a little bit of weight to it, but that's to be expected with a full metal housing. Now, without the hand and thumb grip, you may eventually find that this camera becomes a little uncomfortable to hand carry throughout the day, but if you're used to Leica's traditional rangefinder cameras, this might be no problem for you, especially if you're using a neck strap. I used to prefer to hand carry this camera with a wrist strap, but found that my hand would eventually cramp up throughout the day, whether I had both grips on or not. I eventually converted to using a neck strap to side carry it instead. Lastly, what I do appreciate about this camera is how simple and straight to the point it can be. When it comes to street photography, the last thing I want to do is add additional distractions or complications to my shooting experience. With the Leica screen display, customization options, and settings, you can definitely see how simple this camera setup can be. However, sometimes I do notice some lag when going through this camera, such as if I'm powering it on for the first time in a while, or if I'm simply switching through screens such as live view to my playback or settings menu. So I do wish that Leica would improve this in a future firmware as well. I'm pretty happy with this camera. It's sharp, fun to shoot with, and simple. It's been really easy to travel with, and being able to get these same high-resolution photos that I would from, say, my Sony a7R5 is pretty awesome, minus having to carry a bulkier body and a bulkier lens. On top of that, I still get the Leica shooting experience. I've always loved shooting with the Leica M4-2, but I didn't always have accessibility to film, development, or what I like to call patience. Sometimes I simply want to see my photos at the end of the day, and in this day and age we have the luxury to do that with digital cameras such as this one. Now, of course, this camera does have some things that do need to be improved, considering it's still a $6,300 point-and-shoot camera, but I don't regret my purchase at all. It's absolutely a gateway into the digital Leica world. Hopefully I can even get my hands on one of their digital M series cameras in the far future. Like I said, I haven't owned the Q3 for too long, so that pretty much sums up my initial thoughts on this camera so far. If you have questions about this camera or anything in general, feel free to drop them down in the comments, and if you want to see more videos from me, you know what to do. Hit that like, subscribe, and it'll help out the channel very much. That's pretty much it, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.